He had only one wish before his execution, to see his dog Valor one last time. But when that loyal German shepherd growled at a prison guard, everything changed. What followed wasn't just a reunion. It was the unraveling of a lie, buried beneath years of silence, blood, and fear. This is the true story of how a forgotten man, a faithful dog, and a whisper in the dark lit a fire that brought justice to light. Sometimes, a single bark before dawn is enough to wake the world. The iron gates of Redstone Federal Penitentiary clanged shut behind the delivery truck as a low fog hugged the asphalt. Inside cell block D, the cold air bit through the cracks in the concrete like invisible teeth. In a corner cell, Caleb Monroe sat on the edge of his cot, unmoving. His dark hair had grown into uneven waves, and his once sharp jaw now held the softness of quiet resignation. His brown eyes, dim and sunken, stared not at the iron bars in front of him, but at a memory that refused to die. He barely noticed the tray of lukewarm oatmeal pushed through the slot. Food hadn't mattered in weeks. Time had warped into a thick, gray soup, seasoned only by the ritual counts and the distant bark of guard dogs echoing off cement. But that morning something had changed. A guard stopped by his cell, a different one, not part of the regular rotation. His name tag read M. Heller, and his face was new, young, clean-shaven, and oddly nervous. "You got 5 minutes," Heller said, voice clipped. "Warden approved a special request." Caleb turned slowly. "Request?" His voice cracked with rust. "I didn't ask for anything. You did. A month ago. Last wish." The guard hesitated. "The dog." Caleb's breath caught. He had written the letter in the middle of a sleepless night, half in prayer, half in delusion. He hadn't expected it to go anywhere. Just a final thread thrown into the void. "My dog." "Valor." The guard didn't answer. He merely unlocked the door and gestured. Caleb followed, his legs stiff from disuse, his mind fogged. He hadn't said that name aloud in 2 years. Elsewhere, the sun had just broken through the clouds over a modest veterinary clinic on the edge of Redstone. Inside, Ellie Dawson, 29, wrapped a thick scarf around her neck as she entered the back room, cradling a cup of chamomile tea. Her copper-red hair was tied into a messy bun, and the circles under her gray eyes told of long nights. She'd only been in Redstone for 5 months, arriving from Portland to escape the chaos of her former life. A failed engagement, a miscarriage, and an overwhelming sense that the city was too loud to hear herself breathe. Now, her mornings were filled with purring cats and limping strays. It helped. Most days. She glanced over the clipboard of scheduled visits. One name leaped out. Valor German Shepherd, male, 6 years old, special delivery. Redstone Penitentiary, handler. Heller, M. "Strange," she murmured. "We don't usually do prison calls." She flipped through the old file. The digital records showed scattered visits under a previous owner, Caleb Monroe. Her eyes lingered on the intake photo. A proud black and sable German shepherd with alert ears and soft, intelligent eyes. Her brow furrowed. There was something off. An older scanned document had been overwritten. The vaccination card had a faint signature beneath the newer one, barely visible under UV light. That kind of edit wasn't protocol. Ellie muttered. She printed the document, made a note, and folded it neatly into her coat pocket. Back at Redstone, Caleb stood in the visitation yard, where a single folding chair and table had been set under the open sky. Snow crunched beneath his boots. His breath misted out in front of him. Then he heard it. The low, familiar whine. The quick scratch of claws on pavement. The jingle of a chain leash. And then, through the fog, came a figure. "Valor." The shepherd's eyes met Caleb's, and the dog froze. "Valor." Caleb whispered. It only took a second. Valor sprinted, leash slipping from the handler's grip. Caleb dropped to his knees as the dog crashed into his chest, tail whipping wildly, soft growls of joy bubbling from his throat. Caleb buried his face into Valor's thick winter coat, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. "I thought they gave you away." Valor licked his cheek, then barked once. Sharp. Alert. He turned his head to the side, toward the handler. Heller, standing by the edge of the yard, flinched visibly.
Valor growled.
Not at Caleb, at the guard. The moment was subtle, almost dismissible. But Caleb had trained Valor himself. He knew that growl. It was the growl of recognition. Later that evening, back at the vet clinic, Ellie examined the printed file again. She couldn't let go of that hunch. She searched for the name of the previous vet on the overwritten record. Dr. Stephen Murch. Dead. 2 years ago. Apparent heart failure. She scrolled further and saw a flagged note. Suspicious entry M. Slate, unauthorized animal drop-off, March 19, 2021. Her heart skipped. Slate. That name sounded familiar. She pulled up the Redstone staff directory. Among the listed guards, Slate, Brody, Senior Corrections Officer. Assigned, Cell Block D. Her hands trembled. She looked back at the note she'd printed, then at the image of Valor. There was more to this story. Much more. The visitation yard had long since emptied, leaving only footprints in the snow and a faint smell of winter on steel. But inside a gray administrative office, Caleb sat across from his court-appointed lawyer, Marla Jennings, a woman in her mid-40s with tightly pulled-back hair and a voice like snapping twine. "You think the dog growling means something?" she asked, tapping her pen against her yellow legal pad. Caleb leaned forward. Valor was trained to detect agitation, fear, chemical traces. He only ever growled when something was off. Marla pursed her lips. "And you think this something off connects to your case?" "I think he recognized the guard. Not from the yard. From that night." Caleb's voice trembled. Not with desperation, but conviction. "He was there." Marla scribbled something, then looked up. "The problem is you're out of time. The state won't retry a conviction from 2 years ago unless we have new, substantial evidence." Caleb said nothing, but in his mind, the memory of Valor's snarl echoed louder than steel doors. Across town, Ellie Dawson had just finished her shift at the vet clinic. She stood in the file room, fluorescent lights humming softly above, scrolling through archived reports from March 2021. One file stood out, unscheduled drop-off, March 19, 2021, German Shepherd, male. Injured paw handler, unknown, signed, M. Slate. Attached to the form was a fuzzy black and white security camera still. Ellie enlarged it. The man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but the posture, the sharp shoulders, the limp on his right side seemed familiar. She compared it to the photo of Brody Slate on the Redstone staff site. Same build, same walk, same limp. She printed it. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You should stop looking. Things get lost out here." She froze, then deleted it, and printed another copy of the file. Back at the prison kennel facility, Valor had been temporarily placed in a holding run. But Valor refused to sit still. He paced the length of the enclosure, ears rotating, nose high in the air. Every time a guard passed, especially Brody Slate, he stiffened and growled low, eyes fixed. Brody chuckled without amusement. "Dog's broken," he muttered, tossing a half-eaten protein bar toward the fence. Valor didn't touch it. Another guard, Thomas Granger, younger and gentler, approached from the opposite side. "That dog doesn't like you," Granger said, half-joking.
Brody lit à cigarette.
"It's a mutt. They hate uniforms." Granger nodded slowly, then looked back at Valor, who now stared at him, tail slightly wagging. He knelt. "Hey there, buddy." Valor walked up to the fence and pressed his forehead to the bars. Granger blinked. Meanwhile, Marla drove back into town, stopping by the county library to request a public record search of any complaints filed by inmates about Officer Brody Slate. What she found made her skin prickle. 2 incident reports from 2021 involving excessive force. A sealed internal review. A personnel transfer request from another facility that was denied. She took a deep breath and dialed Ellie's number from a card Caleb had given her. "Miss Dawson?" Marla Jennings. I represent Caleb Monroe. I was about to call you, Ellie replied. There's something you need to see. Later that evening, in a quiet diner near the edge of town, Ellie handed Marla the documents. The security footage, the vet report, the overlap in dates, the flagged inconsistencies. He brought Valor in the morning after the murder, Ellie said, voice firm. Injury to the left paw. No reason given. Signed under a false name. That's not random. Marla's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. This, she whispered, this might be enough. At that moment, the diner door jingled open. A tall man in a ranger coat with snow-dusted shoulders walked in, glanced their way, then took a seat at the counter. Ellie's eyes narrowed. That's the same guy from earlier today. He was watching the clinic when I left. Marla tucked the files back into her briefcase. We need to move carefully. Back in his cell, Caleb sat cross-legged on his cot, holding the edge of the threadbare blanket like a lifeline. In his hand was an old photograph, him and Valor. A summer day by the lake, both younger, freer. A low sound came through the corridor. A bark. Not angry, not loud, just present. Caleb stood and pressed his ear to the bars. Valor, he whispered. Outside, under the darkening sky, a shape moved through the fog, quiet as prayer, strong as faith. And suddenly, Caleb wasn't alone anymore.
Valor Paced.
Inside the makeshift kennel built against the back of the main prison yard, the German shepherd moved with precise agitation, ears flicking toward each sound, nose twitching like a compass disturbed. Since arriving, he hadn't settled. Every time Officer Brody Slate passed by the fencing, Valor's growl deepened. Every time he heard that voice, gravelly, forced calm, tinged with arrogance. His hackles raised as if the air itself was wrong. Thomas Granger stood nearby, arms crossed, jacket unzipped despite the chill. Young, lean, and quiet-eyed, Granger had only been at Redstone for a year. Long enough to learn how things worked, but not long enough to unsee. You remember him, don't you? He murmured to the dog. Valor sat, briefly, then whined low in his throat and pressed his head into the chain link as if to say, please understand. Granger reached into his vest and pulled out a small recorder. No words, just sounds, just instincts. Back in her apartment above the town's tiny bakery, Ellie Dawson sat hunched over her desk, eyes burning from the light of her laptop. The file she had retrieved from the archive earlier, about the drop-off of Valor by M. Slate, was now joined by several scan documents she had dug up from a deep veterinary database used by state authorities. One form in particular made her stomach twist. A medication log. Sedative administered. Acipromazine 10 milligrams. Unauthorized dose. Handler refused to sign. The date? March 19, 2021. The initials at the bottom? BS. She took a shaky breath. Her hands hovered over her keyboard. A text buzzed in, from Marla. Call me. We need to talk. I found an old grievance. Slate was investigated in 2021. Witness went missing. Let's meet. Ellie replied, bring everything. I think I can prove Valor was used to cover up the crime. She closed her laptop, zipped her coat, and tucked the medication log into a folder already full of troubling pieces. Meanwhile, Caleb sat in the dimness of his cell, eyes shut. The sound of Valor's pacing, though muffled by concrete and steel, reached him like a pulse. Marla had visited again earlier that day. Her face was guarded, but she carried weight behind her eyes now, weight of possibility. I filed a motion to delay the execution, she'd said quietly. The court won't overturn anything yet, but I've got a contact in state review. A retired judge. He's listening. Caleb didn't dare let hope bloom. Hope in prison was a dangerous seed. It sprouted too fast, and the frost of bureaucracy always came for it. Still, Valor was near, and the sound of his movement, his stubborn restlessness, it did something. It meant something. He opened his eyes when he heard the whisper of footsteps in the corridor. Not loud, not deliberate, secretive. He stood and waited, heart in his throat. A scrap of paper slid under his door. One sentence, scribbled in nervous handwriting. Check the old locker behind laundry. The jacket still has blood on it. Caleb's fingers trembled as he picked up the paper. No name.
No signature.
Only one person he could think of who had access in doubt. Granger. Later that night, Granger entered the old laundry annex through a side corridor. The hallway hadn't been used in over a year. Mold grew in the corners, and the flickering lights cast strange shadows on the dusty linoleum. He found locker number 27, just as the note had described. He opened it with a master key, and inside, folded neatly, was a blood-stained prison-issued jacket. He stepped back, then reached into his phone to photograph every angle, every stain, and the hidden tag inside. There it was. Slate. B. He sealed the jacket in a brown evidence bag and stuffed it beneath his coat. And in that moment, something shifted in him. Not just professionally, personally, because he'd seen men like Brody before. Men who thought rules were for others. Men who wore the law like a costume but moved in shadows. He wouldn't protect him anymore. The next morning, Ellie met Marla outside the public library. Both women had dark circles under their eyes. Neither had slept. Over steaming coffee, Marla opened a folder. Inmate 16201 Joseph Lee, cellmate of Caleb Monroe in early 2021. Filed a statement against Officer Slate. Disappeared 3 weeks later during a transport. Report says he escaped. No follow-up. Ellie's eyes narrowed. No one escapes Redstone. Not without help. Or silence. I agree, Marla said. And I think Slate buried him. Figuratively or literally. Ellie handed over the drug log, the old vet report, and a printed image of Valor's sedative chart. Proof that Valor was medicated to suppress behavior. Right after the incident, they used him as cover. Slate framed Caleb, used the dog as planted evidence. Marla exhaled slowly. Then it's time to get a judge involved. Officially. Back at the prison, Caleb was called out of his cell unexpectedly. He was led not to the visitation yard, but to the kennel. And there stood Valor, tail still, eyes bright. Granger opened the gate. I thought, maybe he should stay in your cell. Temporarily. Therapy animal exemption. I cleared it with the medical unit. Caleb blinked. Are you serious? Granger only nodded. Valor padded forward, quiet, regal. He placed one paw on Caleb's knee and rested his chin in his lap. In that moment, with concrete around them and fear still hanging in the air, something warmer moved through the darkness. Not freedom, not yet, but loyalty, connection, and the distant sound of walls cracking. Valor slept curled at Caleb's feet. In cell D12, the heavy silence of morning count had been softened by the presence of the German Shepherd. His slow breathing grounding the space like an ember in the cold. Caleb, no longer pacing, sat cross-legged against the wall, one hand absently resting on Valor's fur. It was the first night in over 700 he had slept without waking in a panic. But peace was short-lived in Redstone. Across town, Ellie awoke to the shrill wail of sirens. Smoke billowed from the back of Redstone Valley Veterinary Clinic, rising in thick black ropes against the sky. She ran barefoot down the stairs from her apartment above, coat barely on, phone clutched tight in her trembling hand. The firefighters had arrived fast. The damage was contained to the file room. The cause? Electrical fault, they said. But Ellie had spent the last 3 months working there. She knew every outlet, every breaker, every flicker of voltage. Nothing sparked on its own. She watched as a fireman carried out the melted remnants of her filing cabinet. Gone. The original sedative logs. The transfer notes. The time-stamped receipts. Only digital backups remained, and even they weren't as solid in court. Ellie closed her eyes and whispered, "They're scared." Meanwhile, in the warden's office, Brody Slate was leaning against the window, watching snow pile against the outer wall of the yard. His jaw worked slowly as he sipped bad prison coffee from a mug that read, Redstone Staff Excellence Award 2019. A knock came. Officer Granger entered. "You asked for me?" Brody turned. "Yeah." Something's up with Monroe. That mutt's got him all riled. Lawyers sniffing. Girl vet poking around. He paused. You're still working that night shift, right? Granger didn't answer. Keep an eye on them, Brody said. Especially the dog. I hear it's back with him. Granger nodded once and left, expression unreadable. Outside the office, he clenched his fists. Back in cell block D, Caleb received an envelope during midday mail. Inside, 3 blurry printouts.
Surveillance image.
One showed Brody Slate dragging a heavy object down a side hallway. Another showed the same hallway shortly after, with nothing there. The final image. A time-stamped frame from the prison kennel, March 20th, 2021. Valor limping on his left paw, entering the facility. The sender? Unknown. Only a scribbled note. Not all guards lie. That night, Ellie knocked on Marla's motel room door, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. They torched my clinic, she said simply. Or at least the evidence inside it. Marla didn't blink. She was ready. They're desperate, she replied. And desperate men make mistakes. She opened a manila folder and laid out the chain of events. Vet records tying Valor to the crime scene. Surveillance footage showing Brody moving something suspicious. Sedative logs signed under coercion. Testimony from Caleb and notes from his prior behavior requests. I'm filing for an emergency injunction. If we're lucky, we get a judge who wants their name attached to a redemption story. Ellie nodded. But that's not enough, she said. We need someone who saw everything. Marla leaned back, thoughtful. What about the missing inmate? Joseph Lee? Ellie asked. Yeah, they say he escaped. But if he didn't, someone has to know where he went. Later that week, a low-ranking janitor named Ramon Velasquez came forward. He'd worked night shifts in Redstone for 15 years, kept his head down. But he remembered a specific night when Officer Slate had ordered the transfer of an injured inmate in a non-standard vehicle. No ambulance, no paperwork. And then, no follow-up. I cleaned that hallway after, Ramon said softly to Marla in a taped interview. There was blood, and bleach, and Slate's boots in the corner, wet with snow inside. The interview was sealed, backed up, and sent to 2 separate legal channels. Back at the prison, Caleb knelt beside Valor during evening rounds. I don't know what they're hiding, he murmured, stroking the dog's ears. But you remember it. You saw it. You felt it. You've been trying to tell them all this time. Valor tilted his head and let out a soft, almost human whine. As if to say, I never forgot. Just after midnight, Granger walked into the cold kennel and sat beside the file cabinet. From under his coat, he pulled a plastic bag. Inside was the blood-stained prison jacket. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, Time to burn you down, Slate. He placed it in a thermal case and wrote one line on the label. Evidence? DNA test requested, urgent. And for the first time since joining Redstone, he didn't feel like a cog. He felt like a spark. Brody Slate knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Officer Granger stopped making eye contact. In the silence of the other guards who once greeted him with casual nods. In the way the warden shifted in meetings, rubbing his temple longer than usual when Brody entered the room. And then came the call from his ex-wife. He didn't answer, but he knew what it meant. She was talking. In her small, sun-worn home just outside Casper, Lena Slate opened the door to Marla and Ellie with trembling hands. She hadn't seen Brody in over a year, not since the divorce was finalized. But something about her face, the cracks in her voice, the exhaustion behind her eyes, told them she'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. When we were still together, she began. He came home one night, March 19th, I think, soaked in sweat and pacing like he'd seen a ghost. Said something about a screw-up and blaming the kid. I didn't press. I didn't want to know. Ellie leaned forward. Did he mention Caleb? Lena hesitated. He said, the dog did what it was trained to do. The kid just had to be in the wrong place. She wiped a tear. He thought he'd be promoted for stopping the theft. Said they needed a clean narrative. No witnesses. Just closure. Marla's hand tightened around her pen. Would you be willing to testify? Lena nodded slowly. It's time someone did. Back at Redstone, Caleb and Valor were taken to the infirmary for what was labeled a routine health check. But the nurse wasn't familiar. Neither was the officer standing outside the door. Inside, Caleb noticed the subtle red marks on the forebag. Don't hook that up, he said. The nurse blinked. Excuse me? Caleb's eyes locked with hers. I said don't. You weren't briefed on my allergy? Were you? She stiffened, then backed away. Outside, Valor growled. Moments later, Officer Granger entered the room, calm but swift. You need to come with me. Now. He didn't wait for permission. He took Caleb by the arm and led him down a hallway that didn't belong to any official route. Valor followed, tense but quiet. They ended in a maintenance closet. Granger locked the door. They tried to take you out, he said. Fake injection. You weren't supposed to walk out of that infirmary. Caleb's face went pale. Why? Because we're getting too close. The jacket's with a forensic contact now. Results in 48 hours. But Slate's watching everything. If we move now. That evening, Ellie stood outside the county courthouse, holding a flash drive in her gloved hand. Inside it were three things: the voice recording from Lena, Granger's report, a 3D scan of the bloodstain jacket, showing type B negative blood matching the missing inmate Joseph Lee. Marla met her on the steps, eyes serious. This is enough, she said. We file in the morning. Petition to delay execution becomes a petition for full retrial. Ellie breathed out, her breath curling in the air like mist. Then it's real. Yes, Marla nodded. Now we just have to keep Caleb alive until then. Back in his cell, Caleb sat beside Valor, one hand gripping the edge of the cot, the other resting protectively on the dog's back. Something's coming, he whispered. I can feel it. Valor looked up and licked his hand once, firm and deliberate. That night, Slate stood outside the warden's office, shouting, You think I don't know what's going on? That I don't see who's feeding them information? The warden remained silent, his face pale. On the desk was a printed copy of the forensic lab's response. Sample confirmed. Blood belongs to Joseph Lee, reported deceased. Source: Slate. Brody implicated. Brody stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Across the yard, Granger watched from the shadows. He wasn't afraid anymore. Valor stood perfectly still, not sleeping, not whining, just waiting. His amber eyes were fixed on the door, as if he already sensed something would come through it. Caleb, seated cross-legged on the thin mattress, was staring at the concrete wall but listening to the dog's breath. For weeks, Valor had been Caleb's anchor, his last link to a world outside of guilt and fluorescent lights. But today, Caleb felt a shift. The walls had started whispering. Across town, Ellie Dawson stood in front of the county judge's chambers, heart pounding beneath her wool coat. She wasn't dressed like a lawyer. She didn't speak in courtroom vernacular. But today, she was holding a sworn affidavit, a signed witness statement from Lena Slate, and a chain of evidence strong enough to fracture concrete. Marla stood beside her, composed as ever. In her briefcase, the lab results, surveillance photos, audio recordings, and an official petition for retrial and full exoneration. Inside, Judge Keating, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and the cold patience of a winter storm, read in silence. Then he looked up. This dog, he asked, tapping the file. Was he at the scene? Yes, Your Honor, Marla said. And he was manipulated into becoming part of the cover-up. He's not just a witness. He's evidence. The judge considered this, then placed his glasses on the desk. You'll have your emergency hearing 3 days from now. But I warn you, this had better be bulletproof. Marla nodded. It is. That evening, in the staff wing of Redstone, Brody Slate paced in his quarters like a panther in a too-small cage. He was getting sloppy, angry, and worse, nervous. He knew something was coming. He could smell it. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a key ring. One brass key, unmarked, slightly worn. It opened the storage facility behind the old east wall. The place where secrets went when no one had the courage to carry them. He was going to clean up. One last time. But someone was watching. Granger, tucked behind a ventilation access point, followed him. From a distance. Through snow. Through shadow. He didn't need backup. Not tonight. This was personal. Meanwhile, back in the prison yard, Valor began to howl. Not loud. Not wild. But long. Low. Mourning. Caleb stood immediately. "What is it?" he whispered. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then again. In the hallway, a second guard ran past shouting, "East block. He's in the tunnel." Behind the old boiler room, Brody Slate knelt in front of a rusted metal crate. Inside, rags, chains, blood-stained gloves, a flashlight. He reached for a half-buried photo frame. Joseph Lee smiling, arms slung over a Labrador, and he froze. Footsteps. Slate turned, drawing his baton. "Who's there?" Granger stepped into the light, hand held high. "It's over, Brody." Brody laughed. "You think a rookie with a badge and a heart can end this? I think Valor already did." Brody's smile twisted. "That dog doesn't know the difference between guilt and duty." Granger shook his head. "No. But he knew the difference between you and Caleb. And so do I." What happened next was fast. Slate lunged, but Granger had expected it. He ducked, slammed his shoulder into Slate's chest, sending the older man crashing into the metal crate. As Slate reached for a concealed blade, Granger pinned his wrist and shouted into his radio. "Code Gray. Repeat, Code Gray. East Tunnel. Slate in custody." Within minutes, guards poured in. Brody Slate was dragged away in cuffs, shouting curses that echoed like cracked bells through the stone halls. 3 hours later, the warden signed the formal removal of duty for Brody Slate. He would face trial on obstruction, falsifying evidence, assault, and suspected involvement in the death of Joseph Lee. Marla received the call just after midnight. She smiled for the first time in weeks. The next day, Caleb was brought to a holding room, not a courtroom, not a cell. A warm, quiet space. Marla walked in and set down the paperwork. "You're getting your hearing. The charges won't hold." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "It wasn't just the evidence, was it?" "No," Marla said. "It was the bark." Before dawn. He closed his eyes, and Valor, seated beside him, rested his chin on Caleb's boot. At that same moment, Ellie stood outside the old veterinary clinic. It had reopened temporarily. New locks, new alarms. Same sign. She held in her arms a new file. Lee Joseph, declared deceased. Status under review. She didn't cry. Not this time. She simply placed the file on a shelf beside another marked, Monroe Caleb. One story ending. Another beginning. The courthouse buzzed with subdued tension. Inside the main chamber, the wooden benches were lined with unfamiliar faces. Journalists, local townspeople, retired correctional officers, and a few quiet inmates in transport shackles brought to testify. No one made a sound. Caleb Monroe sat beside Marla Jennings at the defense table. He wore a borrowed suit that hung too loosely on his frame, but he held his head high. Valor lay at his feet, ears perked, tail curled beside the polished floor. The prosecution team, led by Assistant DA Hank Roston, wore tight expressions and thinner arguments. They had read the report. They knew the case had unraveled. At the front, Judge Keating adjusted his glasses, looked at both sides and said, "Let us begin. First witness, Officer Thomas Granger." Calm, composed, and now with the quiet weight of conviction, Granger walked through the entire chain of events. Slate's manipulation of evidence, the forged injury reports, the unauthorized sedation of Valor, the concealment of Joseph Lee's fate, and finally the moment in the East Tunnel, the attempt to destroy the last traces of truth. He ended with, "I was afraid, but that dog, he wasn't." He remembered, and that gave the rest of us a reason to look again. Second witness, Lena Slate. She stepped to the podium with shaking hands, but her voice grew stronger with each word. "My ex-husband came home covered in blood," she said. "He said it was over, that he'd buried it all. But he was wrong. You can't bury guilt. And you can't kill truth, not when a dog's still carrying it in his eyes." Third witness, Ellie Dawson. She presented the sedative logs, the vet records, the photo evidence. But what moved the courtroom wasn't just data. It was her passion. "This wasn't a paperwork error," she said. "It was a human error. A man who thought a dog couldn't speak. But Valor did speak, through behavior, through instinct, through memory. He never forgot what Slate did. He just waited for someone to listen." The prosecution declined to cross-examine. By noon, they knew the tide had turned. Then came the final motion. Marla stood and requested full dismissal of all charges against Caleb Monroe, citing malicious prosecution, withheld evidence, and official misconduct. Judge Keating took a moment, one long, reflective pause, then struck the gavel. "In light of overwhelming evidence, this court hereby vacates the conviction of Caleb Monroe. The state of Wyoming acknowledges its error. Mr. Monroe, you are free to go." The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in a wave of exhaled silence, like a weight lifted from an entire community. Caleb turned to Valor. The dog stood, then placed both front paws on Caleb's knees, nose pressing against his chest. No one could hear what passed between them in that moment, but everyone felt it. Outside the courthouse, the snow had begun to melt. Marla, Ellie, and Caleb stood together on the steps. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted questions, but their circle held quiet. "So what now?" Ellie asked. Caleb looked down at Valor. "We go home." "Where's home?" Marla asked gently. Caleb smiled just a little. "Where he is." Later that evening, at a small cabin near the edge of town. Once abandoned, now restored, Caleb stood by a crackling fire, running his hands through Valor's thick coat. Ellie unpacked boxes nearby. Marla leaned on the porch railing with a mug of cider, watching the stars emerge. Granger knocked on the door, a small file in hand. "Thought you should see this." Inside, the official coroner's report on Joseph Lee. His remains had been found sealed in a drainage chamber beneath the prison's east wing. Death, blunt trauma, consistent with Slate's timeline. Cause murder. "Justice will be served," Granger said quietly. "This time for everyone." Caleb nodded. That night, as the fire dimmed and silence returned, Caleb sat on the floor beside Valor. "No more cages," he whispered, "for either of us." Valor leaned in and, for the first time since their reunion, let out a soft, restful sigh. The cabin was modest, stone hearth, 2 rooms, one wide porch that faced the rising sun. It had once belonged to an old forest ranger who died without family, his property left to gather dust and silence. Now it breathed again. Inside, Caleb Monroe placed the final photo frame on the mantel. A picture of a younger him, smiling awkwardly beside Valor, both muddy from some forgotten hike. The caption read, "We go through it together." Valor lay sprawled across a woven rug near the fire, tail thumping with every creak of Caleb's footsteps. He looked older now. His eyes held more stories than most men twice his age, but he was home. Ellie arrived just after breakfast, arms full of boxes, folders, and 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her red hair was tucked into a knit beanie, and her jeans were coated with dust from the shelter site down the road. "You're late," Caleb teased as he opened the door. "I was meeting with the county," she replied, stepping inside. "They approved the license." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Already?" She grinned. "Redstone Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation Center is now officially a non-profit." He looked down at Valor. "Did you hear that, buddy? You're going corporate." Valor barked once, sharp and amused. Later that week, they opened the gates to their first 3 rescues. A blind Labrador named Duchess, a 3-legged mutt named Toby, and a traumatized German Shepherd named Ghost, who hadn't wagged his tail in weeks. Caleb spent hours sitting silently beside Ghost's enclosure, just as he once had sat with Valor in those long, hopeless days. He didn't rush, didn't speak, just breathed. By day 4, Ghost took a step closer. By day 6, he leaned against Caleb's leg. By day 10, he let out a sound, a soft huff, and wagged his tail. Once, at the shelter's dedication ceremony, Marla stood behind a wooden podium set beneath fluttering canvas. She cleared her throat. There are many stories in this world of pain, but not all of them stay there. Some crawl, some bark, some howl their way out. This place isn't just for animals. It's for people who forgot what hope looks like. She turned toward Caleb and Valor. They reminded us. Granger transferred from Redstone to become the center's community safety liaison. He wore no badge, carried no weapon, but every kid who passed through the center followed him like he was a sheriff of second chances. One of them, Mikey, a quiet teen in foster care, took special interest in Valor. "Did he really save your life?" Mikey asked one afternoon, brushing the old dog's coat. Caleb knelt beside him. "No," he said, smiling. "He just reminded me it was still worth living." One foggy morning, Caleb stood with Ellie on the porch. The mist rose from the valley like a soft prayer. Birds began to sing. "I still hear the gates sometimes," Caleb admitted quietly. "In my sleep." Ellie touched his hand. "But you wake up here now." He nodded. "And that makes all the difference." As the sun rose over the mountains, its light caught on the wooden sign at the gate. "The bark before dawn, a sanctuary for the forgotten," and beneath it, carved into the bottom slat, "In honor of Valor, the dog who remembered." That evening, Valor stood by the fire, watching the flames. Behind him, Caleb sat beside Ghost and Duchess, writing intake notes by hand. And just before the stars came out, Valor raised his head, looked out the window, and barked once toward the dark. Not a warning, not fear, a declaration. This is home. In a world where voices are often silenced and truth is buried deep beneath power and fear, one dog refused to forget. Valor didn't speak in words, but in loyalty, memory, and love. This story reminds us that healing begins not in the noise of judgment, but in the quiet acts of faith, of those who wait, believe, and never stop searching for the light. Just like Caleb, many people today are trapped in cages of injustice, abandonment, or pain. But miracles don't always come with thunder. Sometimes, they come in the form of a paw resting gently on your lap, or a bark in the still of night. If this story touched your heart, type Amen in the comments to honor those still waiting for their dawn. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice might be the key to someone else's freedom. May God bless you and all who believe in second chances.
He wasn't supposed to be out there. A 10-year-old boy alone, lost in the canyons where even adults fear to tread. No signal, no light. Just a broken leg and a long drop between him and the end. And no one knew he was gone. No one. Except the old German shepherd limping toward the edge. What happens next will restore your faith in loyalty, in instincts stronger than any searchlight, and in a bond that even death couldn't untie. This isn't just a rescue story, it's a reckoning. Before we begin, tell us where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city, your country right down there. And if you've ever had a dog that would have followed you into the dark, hit that subscribe button. Because this one's for every soul who's ever believed a dog could be more than just a pet. The Colorado sun had already begun its slow descent behind the jagged ridgelines when the wind started whispering across the dry plains outside Redstone Ridge. The town was nestled on the border of ranchland and old mining territory where rusted watchtowers and shale cliffs loomed over sun-bleached buildings. Heat still rose in visible waves off the gravel roads, though thunderheads loomed far off in the east, an uncertain promise of rain. That evening, in a 2-story farmhouse just outside town, a boy was getting ready to disappear. Noah Gallagher was 10 years old, with sandy brown hair that curled behind his ears when it got too long, and a complexion freckled by countless afternoons in the sun. He was small for his age, thin in a way that made him seem all knees and elbows, but his eyes, hazel with flecks of storm gray, were sharp, constantly observing the world with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak much, not since the accident, but he drew. Whole worlds poured from his fingers, canyons filled with beasts, forests haunted by shadows, and always the same dog by his side. That dog was Rex, a 5-year-old German shepherd with sable-colored fur and deep golden eyes. His coat was thick but dull in places where old scars interrupted the pattern. A jagged line ran down his left flank, a remnant of his days as a search and rescue K9. Rex walked with a slight limp in his rear leg, a result of a collapsed foot joint that ended his service prematurely. He had the posture of a soldier who never stopped watching the door. Yet with Noah, he was something else entirely, gentle, attentive, always listening. The boy never spoke aloud, but Rex heard everything in the silence. Noah lived with his grandparents Walter and May Gallagher in the same house where his father had grown up. Walter, a retired mining foreman, was tall and broad-shouldered with a weathered face that still bore coal dust deep in its creases. His gruff voice carried across the porch with authority, but when he looked at Noah, the sharpness softened. May, small and silver-haired, moved slower these days, but carried herself with the grace of someone who had once been a school librarian. She still read aloud, sometimes hoping Noah would eventually join in again. They never pressured him to talk, not after the crash. It had been 8 months since the accident that claimed Noah's parents. A logging truck had jackknifed on a wet mountain road, crushing the family's SUV. Rex, by some strange twist of fate, had been found wandering near the wreck and was later adopted by the Gallaghers through a local rescue group. No one understood how or why he was there. Some said it was coincidence. Walter called it providence. That evening, while the old house buzzed with cicadas and the scent of May's stew filled the kitchen, Noah sat in his room sketching a cliffside. Sharp layered rock, shadows falling into a deep hollow, a small figure near the edge. His pencil trembled slightly as he added the outline of a dog. Something in his chest pulled tight. He stood quietly, slipped on his sneakers, and grabbed his backpack. No one saw him climb out the bedroom window. The canyon he had drawn, Rustback Hollow locals called it, was about 3 miles from the house, past the wire fences and forgotten trails that led toward the old redstone mining site. It wasn't entirely off limits, but Walter had warned him never to go alone. "Those rocks don't care how old you are," he'd said. "They'll drop you like dust." But Noah had to see it for himself. Something in his drawings kept leading him there, and tonight, with the wind rising and a strange weight in the air, he felt like the canyon was calling. Rex noticed the open window minutes later. He stood from his corner cushion, ears flicking. He sniffed the still air, then moved with purpose, tail low and alert. By the time May called Noah for dinner, Rex was already trotting across the back field, nose to the ground, tracing the scent of his boy. The hike wasn't easy for Noah. The terrain grew wild, fast gravel shifting under his feet, sagebrush scraping his arms. But he moved with a kind of quiet confidence, like someone following a thread in a dream. By the time he reached the edge of Rustback Hollow, the sky had darkened. Clouds gathered heavy above the ridgeline. Thunder rumbled low, distant but real. He stepped closer. What happened next was so fast it barely registered. His right foot hit loose shale. A slide, a gasp, then nothing but the scrape of rock against skin and the feeling of falling. Noah landed hard on a narrow ledge about 15 feet down the cliffside. His leg buckled awkwardly beneath him. He cried out, not loud, not a scream, but a sharp breath of pain that vanished into the wind. He tried to stand, but white-hot fire shot through his ankle. Broken or sprained, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that he couldn't climb back up. He was alone, except he wasn't. Somewhere above, wind shifted, and Rex was already running. The last glimmer of sun dipped below the ridge, turning the cliffside into a wall of shadow as the first hints of night crept across the land. Redstone Ridge was famous for the way its rocks caught fire at dusk, not with flame, but with color. Even now, the red hue still clung to the stone, glowing faintly as if the canyon had a memory of light. In that half-light, a German shepherd emerged from the brush. Eyes, sharp ears pricked his paws, silent on the dust-laced earth. Rex moved like a creature born of instinct and purpose, his nose low, catching every disturbance in the trail. Broken twigs, a scuffed boot mark, the faintest thread of familiar scent riding the breeze. The forest at the edge of the canyon was dense with scrub oak and ponderosa pine, the ground uneven and dotted with boulders as large as cabins. Rex paused at a cluster of rocks where Noah's scent grew stronger, circled twice, then bounded forward again. Thunder rolled in the far distance. The scent of approaching rain floated low and humid, mingling with the dusty resin of pine bark and the sharper trace of sweat. He ignored it. His world had narrowed to one thing: find the boy. Meanwhile, below the ridge, Noah sat hunched on the narrow ledge, the air cooling rapidly now that the sun had faded. The bruises on his shoulder and hip throbbed, but it was the ache in his ankle that gnawed at his will. Every small movement sent a sting through his leg, and even shifting his weight to ease the cramp in his thigh became a negotiation between pain and necessity. He had his backpack, but it was mostly filled with pencils and sketch pads, useless in this moment, except as ballast and company. He pulled out the sketchbook anyway. His hands shook as he flipped to a blank page. In the fading light, he began to draw. The ledge, the sky, the shape of the ridge above, a set of paws approaching. He wasn't sure if it was memory or hope, but he drew Rex coming toward him. The dog's expression, calm, focused, almost human. His pencil snapped mid-line, and he stared down at it for a long time before dropping it beside him. Night was settling in fast. Back in town, Redstone Elementary's lights glowed against the encroaching dark. Inside the cramped office building, Principal Arthur Adams leafed through a small notepad with a furrowed brow. He was a man in his late 50s, built like a man who once played linebacker but had long since traded stadiums for file cabinets. His hair, silvered at the temples, was always combed back neatly, and his shirt sleeves were rolled with precision to his elbows. Known for being firm but fair, Adams had grown particularly protective of his more vulnerable students after his own son had gone missing for 3 days during a blizzard 10 years ago, a trauma that had left him hyper-vigilant ever since. Earlier that afternoon, a custodian had reported a stranger near the playground fence, a man in a faded gray jacket and worn jeans, standing oddly still watching the children during recess. When approached, he had claimed to be waiting for someone, but gave no name. Adams had noted the incident, but thought little of it until he saw a drawing in the lost and found box that chilled him: a cliff, a small figure near the edge, and a black smudge, either smoke or shadow, looming behind. The signature, Noah G. He pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. "It may be nothing," he said into the receiver, "but I think one of our kids is in trouble. And I don't think he's lost by accident." Back in the wilderness, Rex reached the edge of Rustback Hollow just as nightfall sealed the sky above. He paused, his breath, shallow ears twitching toward the canyon's mouth. He let out a low, rising whine. Nothing. He stepped closer to the edge paws, testing loose shale, and leaned forward, sniffing. The scent was here. Not fresh, but here. A paw knocked a stone loose. It tumbled, bounced once, and vanished into the darkness below. A soft echo answered. Rex's body stiffened. He knew. Below, Noah had pressed himself against the rock wall, startled by the sudden rockfall. Then came the sound, the one he'd been waiting for without knowing it, a high-pitched whimper followed by a series of short, deliberate barks. His breath caught. He whispered hoarsely. Rex, above the dog's ears, perked. Another bark, then silence. The distance between them was too far for contact, but not for connection. Rex backed away from the edge, nose working. He circled until he found a narrow path leading to a lower outcrop, closer, safer. Step by cautious step he descended. Noah closed his eyes, tears stinging behind his lids. He wasn't alone. Not yet. And in the shadows of Redstone Ridge, two forms, one boy, one dog, moved closer to each other through rock and fear, separated only by the silence of stone and the urgency of love. The canyon floor was a labyrinth of echo and stillness. Shadows pooled like spilled ink beneath the overhangs of stone, and above the stars blinked into life, one by one, cold and clear. Rex stood at the edge of a narrow outcropping. His paws rooted his amber eyes fixed on the sheer rock face that dropped away into the darkness. He couldn't see Noah not from here, but he knew the scent was too strong, the silence too heavy. The boy was down there somewhere beyond reach, beneath the stone's unyielding skin. The German shepherd, 9 years old, broad-chested, thick-coated, with streaks of gray beginning to weave into the fur along his muzzle, lowered his head and let out a long, rising howl. It wasn't a bark or a whimper. It was a drawn-out sound of urgency, sorrow, and warning all at once. The kind of sound that didn't just travel through air, it carved into it. The wind caught the note and flung it through the ridges where it bounced from stone to stone like an ancient alarm clock long forgotten but still wired into the bones of the land. Far below, Noah stirred. His head lolled against the rock wall, eyelids fluttering. He'd dozed off, lulled by exhaustion and the rhythmic pulse of his own breath. But the howl pulled him awake not with fear but with recognition. He strained to lift his head, lips cracked, voice barely a whisper. Rex. Another howl answered. Noah's eyes filled with tears. He wasn't dreaming. He was still here, and so was Rex. Miles away in a modest home just on the edge of the old mining district, Walter Jennings sat upright in his creaky leather recliner. His television muted, flickered with the blue glow of a late-night weather report. Thunderstorms sweeping through Redstone County overnight. Flash flood warnings issued for canyon areas. But Walter wasn't watching the screen. He was listening. Walter was a wiry man in his 70s with a shock of white hair that stood stubbornly upright no matter how he combed it. His hands, though still steady, bore the scars of decades spent underground, deep lines etched by pickaxes, rope burns, and rust. He'd worked the Redstone mines for 30 years before they shut them down. Now he spent most days tinkering with old maps or fixing radios no one else cared to repair. But that sound, he hadn't heard it in over 40 years. An echo signal, they used to call it. Back when miners needed to communicate across caverns too deep or dangerous to cross. One would howl or whistle with a specific pitch and rhythm, and the other would answer. It was crude, but effective, and unmistakable. Walter stood, his knees cracking. He walked to his cluttered desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a yellowed map of the canyon system. With a pencil, he tapped 3 points along the edge. "If I'm not senile," he muttered, "that's coming from the old south wall near Rustback Hollow." He grabbed his flashlight, an oilskin jacket, and an old canvas backpack stuffed with first aid supplies, flares, and a coil of climbing rope. Outside, thunder rolled low along the mountains, and the wind pressed leaves against his truck's windshield as he drove toward the edge of memory. Back at the ridge, Rex had begun to pace. He circled the narrow outcropping twice, sniffing the rocks, searching for any path downward. But there was no way to descend safely, not for him, not with paws instead of hands. His right hind leg still ached from where he'd slipped earlier, but it wasn't pain that slowed him, it was calculation. Rex was trained. Before retirement, he had served alongside search and rescue teams in the Rockies. He remembered ravines like this. He remembered that sometimes the best thing a dog could do wasn't climb. It was call. He howled again. A longer one this time, split into 3 rising notes. Echo signals. Down below, Noah began to hum. Softly, uncertainly, he mimicked the same 3-note pattern with his lips, Then he coughed and tried again louder. Whoo! 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 His voice cracked, but he kept going. Up above, Rex paused. Ears up. He heard it. 3 short barks. Confirmation. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. And just as Noah thought he might have imagined it all, something fell beside him. Soft, gentle, but deliberate. A small scrap of fabric. Another one. Then a rusted metal bolt clinked nearby. Rex was sending signals the only way he could, one object at a time, nudged from above. He was telling the boy, I'm here. I see you. Stay alive. The rain came softly at first, just a whisper on the canyon's rim, then harder. The rocks turned slick, the air thick with petrichor and electricity, but Rex stayed rooted, his body a sentinel above the storm. Meanwhile, Walter parked his truck on the old access road. The wind tugged at his jacket as he stepped out, flashlight cutting through the dark. He paused at a fork in the trail and listened again. There it was, faint, but real. That howl. Walter adjusted his course. The old paths were still in his bones. As he hiked deeper into the gorge, the flashlight beam caught an old wooden sign long since rotted, half buried in sand, Rustback Hollow. Restricted access. He smiled grimly and picked up speed. The rain had softened into a mist by morning, casting the canyon in a silvery sheen. The rocks, once ochre and rust-red, now glistened under a thin veil of moisture. Somewhere below the eastern ridge, a boy lay trapped with a twisted ankle and the stubborn will not to cry, while above him a dog with a mission kept his post. But this story wasn't only about loyalty and rescue. It was about secrets long buried and those desperate enough to unearth them. Miles away from the canyon's lip, hidden in the shadow of scrub pines near the mouth of the old mine, Travis Horn worked in silence. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, the kind whose build suggested former strength slowly being overtaken by restlessness. His hair was dark, streaked with gray near the temples, and his hands were calloused from years of odd jobs, some legal, many not. He had a habit of muttering to himself, chewing the same toothpick until it frayed. Travis wasn't from Redstone. He'd drifted in from Arizona 2 months prior, renting a trailer on the edge of town and paying cash. Folks figured he was another drifter running from a past too heavy to carry openly. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know the full story, not about the map, not about what he thought was buried beneath the canyon floor. The legend he chased wasn't new. During the Spanish expeditions of the late 1700s, soldiers were rumored to have stashed treasure in the labyrinth of Redstone's cave systems, gold, silver, maybe artifacts too valuable to transport during retreat. Most dismissed it as folklore, but Travis believed it, and he believed the old shaft near Rustback Hollow held the entrance. 2 days ago, he'd seen a boy, alone, standing too close to the ridge near the dig site, watching. Sketchbook in hand. Travis's gut had clenched. He couldn't afford attention, not now, not when he was this close. So he'd crept up behind, silent on the gravel, and muttered just loud enough for the boy to flinch and stumble backward. He hadn't meant for the kid to fall, not really. He'd told himself that, but he hadn't checked either. And when he looked over the edge and saw no movement, just the boy's cap lying on a ledge, he turned and walked away. Back in town, the art room at Redstone Elementary was quiet, save for the sound of charcoal dragging across paper. Ms. Delaney, the art teacher, leaned over Noah's desk, studying the drawing he had been working on before he vanished. Delaney was in her early 40s with cropped red hair that curled just below her jawline and eyes that missed nothing. She wore oversized sweaters and always smelled faintly of turpentine and peppermint tea. A bit of an oddball, students said, but she was kind and fiercely protective of the quiet kids. Noah had been one of her favorites. He never spoke much in class, but his art did. His sketches often showed vivid landscapes, wolves, storm clouds, or quiet moments of people holding hands. But this last drawing was different. It showed a boy tiny dangling on a cliff. Above him, a man faceless with his arms raised. Below, a dog howling into the canyon. The lines were jagged, the shading frantic. The paper had been smudged like someone tried to erase part of it but changed their mind. Delaney didn't hesitate. She slipped the drawing into a folder and walked straight to the sheriff's station. Sheriff Cole Brandt, a barrel-chested man in his early 50s with a weathered face and a badge that always sat crooked on his chest, glanced at the drawing and immediately leaned forward. "Where did you find this, one of Noah's last works?" Delaney said softly. "I think it's more than art." Brandt ran a hand through his graying hair and studied the image again. The dog. That had to be Rex. And the man, his eyes narrowed. Meanwhile, at the edge of the old shaft, Travis paused to sip from his dented thermos. The ground beneath him was slick from the rain, but he'd made progress almost through the last layer of collapsed rock. He didn't hear the crunch of boots behind him. Sheriff Brandt had taken the long way around. He didn't want to spook the man, whoever he was, until he'd seen enough. And what he saw confirmed every bad feeling he'd had since Noah vanished. Tools scattered around, freshly disturbed earth, and something about the man's posture alert but coiled like a spring put Brandt on edge. "Morning," Brandt called out calmly. Travis froze, then slowly turned. "Just out hiking," he said, voice flat. "Funny," Brandt replied. "You don't have a pack." Travis didn't answer. Brandt stepped closer, eyes sweeping the site. "You see a kid out here 2 days ago? Brown hair, maybe carrying a sketchbook?" Travis hesitated just a moment too long. "Can't say I have." But the sheriff had seen the shift in his stance, the flicker in his gaze, and in that moment he knew. Far beneath their feet, the boy stirred again. The rain had chilled the stone, and his lips trembled with each breath. But he hadn't cried. He wouldn't. Because above him, somewhere close, Rex was still howling and help was coming. Rain tapped steadily on the craggy rocks of Redstone Canyon, each droplet a tiny drumbeat against time. Above the drop-off, the landscape was cloaked in gray mist and slicked with mud. The world felt quiet except for one enduring sound, a dog's mournful howl cutting through the canyon like an ancient, unforgotten cry. Rex stood poised on the edge, his amber eyes locked on the spot below where his boy lay. The slope was too steep to descend by paw. The ledge where Noah had landed was barely visible through the mist and brush. Rex paced along the rim claws, scraping stones, searching for anything to bring him closer. And then he saw it. Near an old crumbling post embedded in the earth, half swallowed by years of dust and time, a length of frayed mining rope dangled like a forgotten relic. The post had once been part of the old winch system used by quarry workers decades ago. Now it stood as a broken tooth in the earth, defiant against time. Rex sniffed the rope, tugged it with his teeth, and found it still anchored to the shaft's base. It was brittle but held under tension. Without hesitation, he clamped it between his jaws and began to back up, dragging a portion closer to the edge. Noah lay still conscious, but fading. His small fingers had curled into the red dust, and he blinked against the rain dripping from the rock overhead. His ankle throbbed in pulsing waves, but when the sound of claws scuffling above reached him, followed by a low, familiar whine, his chest hitched. "Rex," he whispered, barely audible. A few seconds later, something dropped from above a rope, rough and worn, trailing into the air, before it landed near him with a wet thump. Up above, Rex gripped the anchored end with all his strength. His body leaned back, paws dug into the mud, and the rope descended steadily over the cliff face. But Rex couldn't see Noah. He could only trust that his boy was smart, that he would understand. Noah reached for the rope, barely able to move his injured leg. With effort, he looped it beneath his arms and braced himself as best he could. That's when Rex began to pull. It was not a perfect system. The rope slipped. Rex slipped. Once he almost lost his grip entirely, claws raking across the rain-slicked soil, his injured leg dragging behind him. But he didn't stop. Inch by inch, he brought the boy closer to the edge. Back in town, a few miles away, Sheriff Elijah Ward reviewed the mine maps inside a dim office lit by the flicker of old fluorescent bulbs. Ward was in his late 40s, tall and straight-backed, with short, steel-gray hair, and the kind of deep-set eyes that always looked like they were calculating 10 moves ahead. Unlike Brandt, who worked the streets, Ward specialized in logistics land records and legacy cases. He wasn't one for emotion, but the drawing Ms. Delaney had brought in earlier that week had unsettled him. Now, tracing a weathered map from 1943, he found something odd. A thin red line snaked from the main quarry down toward a now unmarked area. A service tunnel once used for emergency access and air ventilation ran directly below the point marked Ravine 12C. It wasn't on modern maps, forgotten buried. Ward stood abruptly, shoving the map into a folder. He grabbed his flashlight and keys, calling out to the deputy that he'd be off-road for a while. The sheriff's truck roared to life in the parking lot minutes later, heading toward the old quarry entrance. Back at the canyon, Rex made one final heave, digging his back paws in with a low grunt. The rope rose higher, and Noah's arm reached into the sky. With a final surge, Rex lurched backward, and the boy was there. Mud-covered, shivering eyes, wide but alive. Rex limped forward, collapsing beside him, muzzle pressed to Noah's shoulder. His leg had swollen from the fall earlier, deep purple around a gash on the joint, but he didn't whimper. He only nudged Noah gently, checking his breath, his warmth. Noah held the dog's face and whispered, "You came." Then, as if on cue, Rex let out a low, deliberate howl, rising in pitch until it echoed across the canyon's walls. Again, and again. A signal, a message. Miles away, deep inside the main shaft of the abandoned quarry, Sheriff Ward had found the entrance. The tunnel was narrow, lined with crumbling support beams, and smelled of wet stone. He clicked on his radio, but received only static. Then, faint, almost lost in the wind, he heard it. A howl, muffled, distant, but unmistakably real. Ward moved faster, knees aching, dodging fallen beams as he closed in on the sound. Above him, the canyon opened to sky, but he would take the path beneath. The breath of the canyon was cooler underground, as if the earth itself exhaled centuries of secrets through the old mining tunnel. Sheriff Elijah Ward moved steadily, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the choking dust. Behind him was Walter Griggs, the retired miner whose weathered hands still trembled slightly with age, but whose memories of these tunnels were sharper than any map. Walter was small in stature but unyielding. His back curved but not broken, his voice gravelly from years underground. His faded denim jacket hung loose on his shoulders, and the miner's helmet atop his white hair still bore the sticker from a long-defunct union. He moved slowly but surely, guiding Ward through the maze-like corridor with the certainty of a man who once trusted his life to these stones. Just a little further, Walter muttered, his voice echoing softly. "This shaft, Tunnel 7B, used to run under Ravine 12C. We'd lose ventilation here sometimes. The rocks remember everything, Sheriff." Ward nodded, his boots crunching on gravel. "I heard the howling from this direction. He's still calling." Above them, the storm had calmed to a whisper, but within the rocks, time felt frozen. Then they reached it, the partial collapse Walter remembered from decades ago. Beyond the rubble was the narrow crevice that led toward the base of the ravine. The air smelled of moss and rust. Meanwhile, at the canyon rim, Rex lay beside Noah, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. His breathing was ragged and his injured leg had stiffened, but he still lifted his head when Noah stirred. "Help's coming," the boy whispered hoarsely, fingers still tangled in the coarse rope. His shirt was torn, caked with red dirt, and his skin was pale beneath the smudges. but his eyes held steady, anchored by the warmth of Rex's fur against his side. Then from below, a light shimmered against the rocks. "Hello, anyone up there?" Ward's voice echoed, bouncing through the shaft. Noah sat up straighter, wincing. "We're here? Please up here." Ward pressed his shoulder into the tight gap, straining his voice upward. "Hold on. We're close." Walter set down his lantern and carefully began dismantling the unstable rocks blocking the shaft entrance. His hands moved with surprising dexterity, recalling pressure points, support angles, where to press and where to pull. "This wall's been disturbed," he said grimly. "Recently. Someone's been here." As they cleared the passage, the tunnel widened just enough for Ward to squeeze through. The beam of his flashlight finally landed on them, on Rex lying with mud-dappled fur, and on Noah blinking in relief. Sheriff Noah cried, and the light swung toward his face. Ward's calm demeanor cracked. "You're all right, thank God." He turned to his radio. "This is Ward. I found them, both alive. Injuries but stable. Send medical and extraction to Sector 12C. Use the Tunnel 7B route." Just then, a creak echoed through the shaft behind them. Walter spun around his lamp, casting a long, quivering shadow against the stone. Emerging from the shadows was a man scruffy mid-40s wearing cargo pants smeared with rock dust and a torn hiking jacket. His face was narrow with stubble clinging to sunken cheeks. His eyes darted like a cornered animal. Travis Horn. He froze at the sight of the sheriff, then cursed under his breath. Ward stepped forward, hand resting on his sidearm. "Don't move." Travis Horn. "I presume..." Travis hesitated, then laughed a dry, broken sound. "You think I came here for the kid? I've been chasing this trail for 10 years. There's a chest down there under layers of rock gold coins from the Spanish routes. I mapped the tunnels, rewrote the GPS trails. This whole canyon's a lie." Walter's voice was quiet but firm. "You nearly killed that boy. You call it gold. I call it rot." Ward moved swiftly, placing Travis under arrest. "We'll see what the court calls it. You're done." Back at the ravine, rescue crews had arrived. The rope was replaced with a proper pulley system, and EMTs secured Noah to a stretcher harness. As they began the slow lift up the cliffside, Rex gave one low whimper, trying to rise, but his leg buckled. Walter stepped beside him, crouching gently. "You've done enough, old boy." He placed a steadying hand on the dog's flank as a second harness was lowered. Both were raised together, boy and dog, back into the light. As they surfaced, a small crowd had gathered. News had spread fast. Sarah, the local veterinarian, knelt by the stretcher the moment Rex was lowered. In her mid-30s, tall with a long auburn braid and a calm demeanor, she had a quiet strength shaped by years of tending wounded animals and watching hope rise where science failed. "He's stable," she said softly, "but he needs rest. This leg is sprained badly, possibly fractured. I'll take him to my clinic." Noah reached out, gripping her sleeve. "Please, let me go with him." Sarah smiled. "Of course." The mountain had given back its secrets, and for now at least it had not taken. The sky over Ridge Creek was a pale gold when they brought Rex back. The sirens had long gone silent, replaced by the quiet murmur of the town neighbors with clasped hands. Children peeking from behind legs, teachers, bakers, and retired miners gathered near the veterinary clinic's porch. The town didn't have a hospital, not one that could manage what Rex had been through. But in Sarah Delgado's hands, even a clinic built for cats and coughing raccoons became a sanctuary of life and grace. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and lavender oil. Sarah moved quickly, her boots soft against the linoleum. In her early 40s, she stood tall but lean, the sleeves of her forest green scrub top pushed above elbows etched with quiet strength. Her dark brown hair was knotted into a bun that wobbled when she moved fast, which she always did when a life was in her hands. Years ago, she'd lost her younger brother to a mountain accident, rescuers too late, help too far. Since then, she'd vowed no one, not even an animal, would be too late on her watch. Pressures dropping, she called out as Rex's body lay across the exam table. His honey-colored fur was matted with dried blood and red canyon dust. One paw twitched faintly as if chasing something in a dream. "Hang in there, sweetheart." Outside the glass door, Noah watched through blurred vision. He sat on a bench too big for his frame, his leg now in a soft cast, his cheeks hollow but clean. His clothes had been changed, but the smell of the canyon still clung to his skin like smoke. The adults had wanted him to lie down to rest, but he refused to leave Rex's side. Next to him sat Ms. Delaney, the art teacher with the wide-framed glasses and the calming voice that always sounded like a lullaby for the nervous. She had brought him a sketch pad and some pencils. "For your thoughts," she had said gently. "Sometimes they come out better in color than in words." Noah didn't speak. He began to draw. Inside, Sarah and her assistant, Kyle, tall, quiet, and always chewing mint gum, worked fast. Kyle gently clipped the fur near Rex's wound, revealing a deep gash along the flank. "Too much blood loss," he murmured. Sarah shook her head. "He survived the fall. He pulled a boy up a ravine. This dog is not dying on my table." She injected another dose of fluid, adjusted the oxygen mask, and leaned closer to Rex's ear. "You're not done yet, Braveheart. The world's just beginning to see you." As night descended, the lights in Ridge Creek Veterinary Clinic burned long. Townsfolk brought hot tea blankets and even a portable generator in case the power flickered. Sheriff Ward stopped by, offering a quiet nod through the glass. Mayor Simmons sent flowers and a note handwritten in looping cursive to the bravest heart in Ridge. By midnight, the tide began to turn. Rex's breathing steadied. His tail twitched once. Sarah, who had been sitting cross-legged on the clinic floor, exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging in quiet relief. Noah, still wide-eyed, stood and pressed his newest drawing to the clinic window. On it, under swaths of charcoal shadow, was a burst of gold light, a cave opening lit not by torches, but by something older. Inside the glow stood a dog, and behind him a small figure holding a rope. He titled it, "The Light in the Hollow." 3 days later, the town of Ridge Creek gathered at the community square. There were folding chairs lined with old quilts, paper lanterns strung from pine branches, and a makeshift podium made from hay bales and a picnic tablecloth. Rex, now awake but still recovering, was brought gently in a red wagon pulled by Kyle. His paw was bandaged and a garland of sunflowers hung loosely around his neck. His eyes, golden as the cliffs he'd once braved, scanned the crowd with quiet curiosity. Mayor Simmons, in her navy blazer and sun hat, cleared her throat at the podium. "We gather here today to honor not just a dog," she said, "but a guardian, a companion, a silent hero who reminded us all what love, loyalty, and courage can look like." Noah sat beside Rex, clutching a framed copy of his drawing. When the applause came, it rippled gently like leaves in wind, not thunderous, but full of warmth. A plaque was unveiled near the town's library, "Rex the Dog of Ridge. May his loyalty guide us." But that wasn't all. Sheriff Ward, with his boots polished and voice steady, stepped forward. This event reminded us of how unprepared we are for emergencies in the terrain that surrounds our town. That's why, starting next spring, we'll be creating a new K-9 search and rescue training unit right here in Ridge Creek, and its first honorary member, if he's willing, will be our Rex. The cheers that followed were louder this time. Rex lifted his head, then laid it down on Noah's lap, as if to say, "I've already begun." The fog rolled in like an old friend, wrapping Ridge Creek in a gauzy silence that made the world seem both close and far away. It was the kind of morning where every sound echoed a little longer, every shape softened at the edges. In the Carter family's backyard, still damp with dew, Rex stood quietly beneath the ancient cottonwood tree. The golden retriever's coat had grown back full and healthy, gleaming in the faint light, though a faint scar still traced along his flank like a whispered memory. His ears perked. Out beyond the ridge where the red canyons rose like sleeping giants, a faint howl rode the wind. Not menacing, just haunting. A fragment of nature's voice, lonely but alive. Rex didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply listened. Inside the house, Noah was hunched over the kitchen table, surrounded by pencil sketches and poster paper. His leg had healed well, and while he still limped slightly, it no longer slowed him down. His hair, always unruly, curled over his forehead as he worked on a new design. A drawing of a dog, Rex clearly standing atop a canyon ledge with a small emblem beneath Echo Ridge Unit. Noah's mother, Melissa Carter, moved around the kitchen behind him. Tall and freckled, with sandy blonde hair in a loose braid and gentle but determined eyes, she had carried the weight of fear and gratitude every day since the rescue. That fear, however, had softened into purpose. She now volunteered with the Ridge Creek Emergency Committee, advocating for better wilderness preparedness and animal-assisted rescue. "You're going to show that to Sheriff Ward today?" she asked, setting a glass of orange juice by his elbow. Noah nodded. "They said we could help with the logo. I want it to look real. Serious." Melissa glanced out the window at Rex, still silent beneath the tree. "He seems different today." Noah turned. "He hears something. I think he always has." Later that morning, they made their way to the community center. Ridge Creek's town hall was nothing more than a 2-room wooden building with a faded green roof, but today it hummed with quiet energy. Inside, Sheriff Elijah Ward stood by the bulletin board where maps and flyers usually hung. He was in his 40s, a man of sturdy build and calm authority with graying temples and a slow, thoughtful way of speaking. Today he wore a pressed navy shirt and a silver badge polished to a mirror finish. With him was Julia Ames, a newcomer to Ridge Creek, and a wilderness training specialist brought in to help organize the Echo Ridge Unit. Julia was in her early 30s with copper hair and a short ponytail and a no-nonsense air about her. She wore khaki cargo pants and a fleece vest bearing the insignia of a national rescue network. Her handshake was firm. Her smile was rare, but real when it appeared. Noah stepped forward shyly, handing Sheriff Ward the drawing. Julia leaned over to look. "This is the boy I told you about," Ward said. "Noah Carter. And that's Rex, of course." Julia crouched to meet Noah's eyes. "You gave it a name," Noah nodded. "It's what saved me." His first howl. Like something from far away, but meant just for me. She studied the drawing again, then gave a small, approving nod. "That's a good name, kid. Echo Ridge it is." In the weeks that followed, Echo Ridge Unit began to take form. The town approved funding for gear and training, and a small plot of land near the edge of the woods, once used as a lumber yard, was repurposed for drills and classes. Volunteers of all ages signed up, from retired miners to high schoolers eager to help. And always at the center was Rex. Though he couldn't speak, he taught by presence. In every obstacle course run, every tracking exercise, he was the constant companion, demonstrating patience, precision, and calm under pressure. Julia, once skeptical of emotional dogs, grew quickly attached. "He doesn't need commands," she once muttered during training. "He listens to things we can't even hear." One morning, Sarah Delgado visited the training ground with a medical pack slung across her shoulder. Though she preferred the clinic, she agreed to offer basic animal emergency response training to the new recruits. She walked among the volunteers, her tall frame casting long shadows, explaining how to treat wounds, read animal stress signals, and identify exhaustion. Rex padded beside her, occasionally stopping to sit beside a child or nuzzle a knee. His presence kept everyone calm. Even the most anxious volunteers found themselves standing a little straighter when his amber eyes met theirs. At the end of that week, the town held a second gathering. Smaller than the first, less formal, but perhaps more meaningful. They unveiled a new sign, Echo Ridge Unit Headquarters, carved in wood with Noah's original logo painted beneath. Noah stood beside it with Rex at his side, one hand gently resting on the dog's broad back. Mayor Simmons addressed the small crowd. Sometimes it takes a moment of fear to spark something greater. And sometimes a single voice in the canyon, a howl, a call becomes a rallying cry. This is not just a rescue unit. It is our echo, a reminder that someone is always listening. The crowd applauded. Rex didn't move. He was still, his ears angled toward the far ridge again. And just for a heartbeat it came once more, a faint sound, wind-carried and barely there. Not a howl, just a memory. The canyon whispering back. That night, Noah added one last piece to his sketchbook. Rex beneath the stars, eyes turned to the horizon. The caption beneath read, "The dog who heard the call and answered." Sometimes miracles don't roar from the heavens. They whisper from the edge of a cliff, carried on the wind through the voice of a loyal dog. Rex didn't have words, but he had purpose. He didn't wear a uniform, but he answered a calling higher than himself. In a world that often feels too loud, too cruel, it was the quiet faith of one dog and the small heartbeat of a lost boy that reminded an entire town what it means to believe. This story is more than a rescue. It's a reflection of the grace that watches over us, even in the darkest places. Whether you call it instinct love or the hand of God, something moved through Rex that day. And maybe, just maybe, that same presence is moving through your life too, even now. If you believe that animals are part of God's miracles, if you believe that loyalty, courage, and unconditional love are gifts worth honoring, then take a moment to comment Amen so we know this story reached your heart. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to Kindred Creatures to never miss a tale of faith, love, and second chances. And may God bless you and your loved ones today and always.